Ready. Okay, first thing before we do anything else, can I get a mic check in the chat that people can hear us okay? Testing. And in the meantime, we're here today on the UCLA campus. Cool. So welcome everyone to CANN Journal Club. I'm Twinkle Paryani. I'm the host. I'm the chair of publications for CANN Subdivision of ACS. I have Dr. Miyabe Shields with me, and we're on UCLA's campus doing Journal Club with their Cannaclub. So we have a small studio audience today, which is really awesome. And we're super excited about that. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Miyabe Shields. They graduated from Northeastern University with their PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, specializing in the structural biochemistry of the endocannabinoid system. Dr. Shields has industry experience as well as academic experience leading cannabis research. Previously, they founded a research startup exploring heat-transformed cannabinoids and extracts. And in more recent times, they co-founded a research-focused nonprofit studying natural products of all kinds and prioritizing lived experiences. So one of the shared goals that their nonprofit, which is abbreviated as NAP, and CANN share are communicating research and science education to the public, which is what we're doing today. And for that, we are so thankful to have Dr. Miyabe Shields sharing their perspective and their new research on some publicly accessible data. And usually we have a presenter do the entire presentation, but today Dr. Shields wanted to run the Journal Club like they had it in grad school. So they're going to be presenting part of the data, and I'm going to be doing the figures discussion, and then we're going to have a general discussion afterwards. So feel free to drop questions as we're going, and we might stop during the presentation to have discussions. So this will all be recorded on YouTube, and take it away.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. And Journal Club was my favorite part of my PhD. It's where all the grad students get together with professors in the same department, and we go over other people's research, and then eventually we go over like our own research in colloquium, which usually comes afterwards. So it's sort of like practice for presenting research. And I'm really excited to talk about this white paper that our nonprofit NAP just published, which is a reanalysis of 2 data sets. And this is for ACS, which is a chemistry thing, but this is lived experience data, and this is what is important about the chemistry. And I think it's important to talk about what happens in people who use cannabis, and specifically people who medically use cannabis, and a very specific population that has never been identified. So just a disclaimer, I'm not a medical doctor. None of this is medical advice. Nothing stated in here in the chat or anything would ever be taken as medical advice. I would like to start the presentation with the acknowledgements of the other people on my data team. So this wouldn't have happened without my research partner, Dr. Riley Kirk, and then Ayako Mansell, Sullivan Swift, and Marnay Gerritsen, who is our scientific advisor on real world and lived experience, because our nonprofit, even though we are biochemists and we love chemistry and biology, we specialize in what is the link to lived experience, and how what we see in our communities can be used to inform chemistry and vice versa. So really excited to be here. And this is the structure of it. It's going to be structured just like papers. So every scientific publication that's called a primary literature publication, if you read a news article and it's saying, new research came out this, and they cite that research, it's probably going to be in this format. You have a background, which just tells you why the research is important. You have a methods section, which is how they did the research. The figures are the actual data that they chose to show, like the graphs, like what are in the figures, and then some sort of conclusion or future directions. And I think that it's important to look in this framework and see and understand how we can critically analyze every part of this, and understand how to critically analyze science as well, because the general public is often left out of these conversations. And I think that especially in cannabis, we should be included. We deserve to be included. So this is all the chemistry that is going to be in this talk, is just going to be in the background. This is also my personal background, so people know what my research experience is. I started off in the icosanoids, which is on the bottom. Icosanoids are molecules that our body creates from endocannabinoids, which are up at the top. These are the 2 signaling molecules in the body that I specialized in when I started researching as an undergrad, and then during my PhD in academia. So these are molecules all of our brains and bodies are making. Every one of us is making it right now. For those people who are on the West Coast, we are in like sort of like a decline phase where we're making less of them throughout the day. For the people on the East Coast, they're probably already closer to their lowest point. And the very lowest point is around the witching hour, which is a very common time for people who have chronic issues to have like flares pop up. And part of that reason could be that these molecules are fluctuating throughout the day. These are molecules that every person makes, whether or not they've ever smoked weed, and they activate the same receptors. So the actual thing that I did with my PhD was studying what is here in yellow. These are enzymes, and these enzymes are like little machines that they take the endocannabinoids and they turn them into eicosanoids. So they're taking these molecules and they're cutting them. You could see that this one is smaller than this one, and that's what the enzymes do. And so when you take a drug and you block that enzyme, you're changing the molecules in your body, and that's how you get a therapeutic effect. So Advil and naproxen or Aleve, those are examples of enzyme inhibitor drugs. They work on the enzymes, and that's how they cause their therapeutic effects. And then in pink here, this is the CB1 receptor. This is the receptor that when THC activates it is what you feel when you are feeling the standard effects or the main effects of cannabis that people report. And the endocannabinoids also bind to this same receptor. So that is what I studied during my PhD and before my PhD. And then afterwards, since then, I've been in the industry studying phytocannabinoids and other natural products and other, also just expanding to other plants and other fungi and other things besides cannabis that interact in the same way because these molecules are similar and they mimic the things that are inside our body. And that's what causes these effects. So this really complicated, I'm not going to explain every molecule on here, but what you need to know is that these come from the molecules on the left. So this is just a complicated pathway of what is the metabolism or the lipidome like of all of our bodies. Our bodies are incredibly complicated. We have these main signaling molecules, but there's this incredibly diverse downstream domino pathway of just so many other molecules that our bodies are making. And each one of us, our bodies will be making different amounts of different ones, depending on a huge number of things, like our genetics, like it's our nature and our nurture. It's both of those things that will change. And it's our diet, right? Our exercise. And the difference in these molecules and how these molecules are expressed, like the number of them has actually been linked to specific types of neurodivergence or specific like levels of intensity. Specifically, autism is one more recently has had like lipidome data, but there's been a lot of other data on like specifically the fats. When I say lipidome, I'm talking about just the total number of fats that are in the body. And similarly with cannabis, we see a similar thing. So this is molecular networking data from the aromatic profile. This is actually from Twinkle, from your samples. All these molecules are similar to one another, but they're different. And when they're clustered together, they're clustered by similarity. So you see that the plant doesn't just make THC, right? We know that. And we know that the plant doesn't just make, it's not like a pill. It won't ever be that way. It's making hundreds and hundreds of molecules. And so both our body and our plant have what is called chemical diversity. And it's this total thing that interacts with another total thing. And these two systems that interact that way will be inherently different from a single molecule. So the chemistry of life is both a fractal and a spectrum. So fractals are patterns that when you zoom in on a pattern, it will just become more and more a pattern. I think a lot of people have seen those YouTube videos where you're diving into a fractal. That a fractal is something like another fractal would be the coastline of California. That's a fractal. The smaller of a ruler that you use to measure the coastline, the larger of a number you will get for that coastline to infinity, because you're measuring smaller and smaller pieces and more. And that's a fractal. And a spectrum is a full number of thing that has no discrete start to, it's not stepwise. A spectrum is something that has every piece or every nuance and every gradient within it. And the chemistry of living things like us and like cannabis, it's both a fractal and a spectrum. The more we look into its complexity, it will continue to get more complex. And it's also a full spectrum, meaning that like in both the plant and in humans, we are going to have this like three-dimensional and amorphous flexible thing of the chemistry. The chemistry of one plant will not be the same. The chemistry of a nug at the bottom of the plant is not the same as that top cone. It doesn't smell the same. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't burn the same. And it's not the same. So, oh, wow, there's something I drew on it. Okay, I'll just move on. The point of this is that we have not been approaching our medicine in that way. And we've been approaching our medicine, and my field of pharmaceutical sciences has been approaching our medicine from single molecule, single target type approaches to treating really complex issues. And not all brains are going to respond well to a simple and synthetic medicine. So on the left, that's Prozac, which is fluoxetine. And on the right, it's some sort of benzo. It's oxazepam, which is a benzodiazepine like Ativan or Klonopin. And these are actual ads that came from, oh, I wish I could get rid of this now and figure that out. But Okay. These are actual ads that did happen. Like they are from a time where we clearly were marketing these also towards a demographic, right? And the history of how we, oh, it'll just go away. The history of how we got here has to do with patentability and profitability of these molecules as well. And you can't talk about this without also talking about the fact that the reason why I have the halogens, the fluorines here on the left and the chlorine here on the right circled, is that when I started making social media content, educating people about the active biomolecules that were in cannabis and the endocannabinoids, and I started doing a lot of education with an organic chemistry molecule set, I was immediately stricken by how different the inorganic compounds looked and the synthetics looked, mostly because of the presence of these halogens. Not to say that the halogens don't exist in natural molecules. They can, but they're not common. And they're certainly not common in our signaling molecules, in like our main signaling molecules. For those molecules, it's normally what's called CHONs, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur. And that's what's in all of the molecules, and that's in a vast majority of the molecules in all natural products. These halogens are really strong interactors with receptors. And so if you've ever heard of like, I mean, hydrochloric acid is an easy one. Like they are very strong interactors in general. And so they make the molecules have very strong pulls on these receptors, and that makes their effects more profound. And that has been a good thing for one way of us doing drug discovery, but not everyone responds to it in a bad way. And I also want to state here before I move on that like I in no way shame or feel negatively about psychiatric medication. I've taken it myself. There's no shame in it. It saved my, like benzodiazepines absolutely saved my life before they became a problem. And I think that there's a place for both modalities of help, and there's a place for people to find where things can work together as well. And we have seen that, despite the fact that we aren't able to research it very well because people don't want to talk about it, and then also because doctors don't want to hear about it, and it's a complicated situation. But it's clear that within the community there is an ability for these things to agree with each other. And I don't think that we should be shaming anyone for anyone's choice of medicine. And I happen to be of the people's brains that don't respond well to this medication, but that doesn't mean that that's like what is right for everyone necessarily. And it doesn't mean that these are inherently evil, even just with the marketing and with the whole thing, that they are profitable. They're reproducible and reliable in ways that natural products won't be. And a big issue here is with public education and our ability to be able to self-determine that and have the right type of informed consent, because I didn't have the right informed consent before I took these molecules. And I think that just has to do with not having the right public education, and that's what we're here to fix, right? So before I move on, the last part of the background has to do with neurodivergent and the choice of using neurodivergent instead of mental illness or any of the mental health diagnoses and language. Is that neurodivergent is a umbrella term. It's non-pathologizing, meaning it's not about illness, and it's an identity. It's something that can describe itself, and it's any brain functionality outside of a typical average. So it encompasses a huge number of like mental health and other neurological challenges. And the main stake of this is that it's not an illness, a disease, or a pathology, and it's not something that necessarily has to be cured. It's something that has to be accommodated, and it's something that your life has to be shaped around so that you can live a quality of life. And so that you can be a productive member, or as productive a member of society as you can function to be, because I think that that's something that people don't think of when they think of cannabis, and it ends up being true for a huge number of people and a good number of the population. This is something I've been including in every one of my presentations. This is a science presentation, but it's political, and this is one of the beliefs of NAP, that it's the fundamental role of science to explore and support advances in humanity for the improved understanding of the universe. But the bias that exists in the current society has been created and crafted by years of research that has been interpreted within this pharmaceutical framework. And many stigmatized medicines are never going to fit into that framework or be able to be studied without that bias because of the history that has gone into it. So we have to create and share research opportunities outside of that framework. And this research has been entirely funded by the community. We're an independent research nonprofit, and we collaborate with both academia and the industry. But all of the research that I'm going to present here was completely funded from the community and from the perspective of people who care about this research and want to see it, participated in it. And at the end of the day, I actually said, yeah, I support it. I want to see more of it. And that's really cool. And I think we get different data because of that as well. Okay, so here's the methods. I'm going to go over the two data sets. The first data set comes from the federal government and is from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from 2022. This is the way that they interpret this same data. They use this data to talk about the co-occurrences of what they call mental illness, and depression specifically in this one, but also psychosis is another common thing that they'll speak of and speak to. And then another way to highlight how many people are illicitly using drugs. And so first thing about this data is that it's analyzed for a very clear purpose for what they want to describe, but the data is actually public, or at least it was when I accessed it last year. And so we can download the data and we can reanalyze it in a way that could be informative to our population as well. In fact, a lot of the early trichome data and a lot of the early research on hashish was actually just done by the DEA. And then the underground community, Frenchy Cannoli and such, were like, oh yeah, thanks DEA for they were the only people doing hard research. So it's not, there's a long history of the federal government doing research for a bad way, but our community saying, actually, that's still useful for us. And let's just look at it in a different way. And this is what they did. They did face-to-face household interviews. They also did online Zoom interviews. It's representative of people 12 and older in all the states in DC. But what's pretty important I don't have time to go over in detail how this affects every piece of this data, but they didn't survey people who are unhoused, who are using, who are active in military, in an institutional, any sort of institution like jails or nursing homes or residential facilities and long-term hospitals. So there is a huge population of people who are excluded from this data set. And this is only what I guess you would consider like the working, I would say like a workforce data gathering on that and kids 12 and older. This is how we separated the data using a Python script to just see the total respondents. There were 50,000, didn't look at the children. So 47,100 adults. And then defined daily consumption is 6 out of 7 days per week. And so split off all the daily consumers. And then we'll go over it in the figures, but they have a calculation for whether they consider someone mentally ill, which we call neurodivergent, and then everyone else would go in that typical or average range. And these are the 3 populations that we're going to be looking at the different data from. So they just kind of got filtered out, and we're going to look at how these 3 populations answered different questions on stress, disability, and quality of life. The second data set is from 2023, and it was a survey on the neurodivergent cannabis community that was self-identified, and the data set's publicly available on my personal website, projectchronic.com, and NAP has reanalyzed this data. So I'm going to share a little bit of the background data that I presented. It was kind of cool, actually. I collected and presented this data within 72 hours on a poster at a national level conference. And it was a really cool experience just to know that that could happen, that we can turn information around that quickly and that it can be disclosed to the public, and that we can find new things that then end up informing like future research. And the whole point is that we're not trying to, there's no point in trying to replace anything. It's trying to add something different that this community hasn't had a voice to add to before. So this is the general breakdown of the percentage of what people identified as that they had been categorized as in the past. Over 89 respondents had more than one indication in this, and the average was 3.1. So relatively complex. The neurodivergent cannabis community are not just people, it's not just ADHD, it's not just general anxiety, it's not just CPTSD, or it's not just major depression. Like there's complicated and overlapping things. And I think most of us know that. These are the indications. These are the percentage respondents of the people who responded saying they used cannabis for these different indications. Sleep, pain, and anxiety are the same. They're the top 3 for all cannabis, like both medical and adult use in pretty much all markets I've seen. Those 3 are the top 3: sleep, anxiety, and pain. And then I think it's ironic that we don't talk about mental health when sleep, anxiety, and pain are all integrally linked into mental health and like a critical component to quality of life of anyone with chronic issues. But the cool things about this data was about different indications that people use, like mood and emotional regulation for calming down. I think that's something that people could see for cannabis, but that is not often talked about as a therapeutic use. Processing and integrating, like with memory, a lot of people will talk about cannabis being like, oh, don't use it to escape your problems. You know, some people can benefit from processing with cannabis or can benefit from using cannabis within a realm that is healthy. And we shouldn't be judging people for it. I mean, there's definitely negative ways we can use all substances, sugar and water included. So I think that was an interesting one. Hypersensitivity. And then focus and productivity, since that's the opposite effect that most people seem to associate with cannabis. But this is a very different population, and you can't compare the average and what is the average response to that. So these are the last interesting things from this part of the data set. And then what we're going to talk about that's in the white paper is actually an additional cross-sectional analysis of this. So taking this data and doing a little bit further, seeing like what is what is in common with all of the people who responded. So I thought it was interesting that only 30% of people tried CBG flower products. That was 2023, so maybe that number is higher. But the reason I thought that was interesting is because then in the second one, which is daily dose schedules and ratios, over 600 people wrote me. Thank you if anyone is in here who wrote me. Over 600 people wrote me about things, like specifically things that they have found that have helped them. And we end up having very specific dose schedules, and they're highly personalized. And actually, Dr. Riley Kirk and I, in our longitudinal study, were looking at our own data from 2 weeks. And we were appalled actually at how variable our own use was. I think that I thought that my consumption was more consistent than it was until I actually went to do it. And what that shows is that we're highly nuanced and we understand our medicine. We use our medicine in very different ways for different purposes. And that a huge component of public education is vastly important, specifically for risk reduction, but also just for like optimization. Like, don't we want people to be having the best experience? Like, absolutely. Okay, so now we're gonna do the figures. So take it away.
Okay, great. Okay, so this first figure comes from the CDC data, which was the data that was on specific drug usage. And this is using the Kessler Psychological Distress Index or something to that effect, where the x-axis is the percentage of people who are experiencing it, either in all participants or daily consumers. And the y-axis is the value of distress that they're experiencing. So 13 being experiencing severe distress or severe psychological stress in their, I assume, daily life. And so you can see that the lower the daily stress, the higher the so generally the average population is experiencing less stress than cannabis users on a daily basis, and that as this level of psychological stress increases, daily use also increases. And you could look at that in a lot of different ways, but I think that the journal article that Dr. Shields wrote and the perspective that they're highlighting here is signifying that you could say that, and I think that the original intention you could say is this shows that people who are using cannabis are using it because they are stressed, or you could interpret it the other way, that people are stressed and then therefore they are using cannabis. But I think what we know from the community and what we know as users and people who are interacting with users every day, all day, we know that one of these is pretty clearly obvious and the other more obvious than the other.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to argue with the fact that the general population shows an exponential decay. So an exponential decay is where something continuously gets less and less and less. So if you go to the general population, you say, how stressed are you? Most of them are not stressed at all. Like, they're in that 3 or minus. And like, I can't tell you what percentage of my days are at a 3 or minus. Like, I can't tell you if my brain has ever been under a 3 in like level of like stress or anxiety. I have a lot of thoughts, but that's the general population is going to be up there, and it drops exponentially down. And the fact that cannabis and the daily cannabis consumers don't follow that trend, people want to read into that as the cannabis causes that stress, right? Like, the cannabis is the thing that makes you a bad person. That is the reason why you're having that much psychological stress. But there is an equal but opposite potential situation here, which is that there is additional psychological stress on brain types that we know that some brains experience higher levels of psychological stress just in different sensory environments, just in different obligatory demands upon your day.
So there's a question here that someone is saying, does the fear of withdrawal create anxiety or stress? So they're saying that, like, do high users experience anxiety about not having access or about having withdrawal when they're not able to access? And I think this specific scale that they're using, the psychological scale, is more evaluating like the stress in your everyday life and the way that you respond to situations that may not be stressful to the average person, or the average person who does not experience like these neurodivergences. That's what we're trying to highlight here.
And absolutely, people have stress about scarcity, and that scarcity is a huge problem. Oh, we have a couple of questions here. But yeah, and that definitely also the stimulant scarcity and the way that stimulants are currently being regulated pharmaceutically is an equal thing that, like, absolutely. I mean, people experience stress of all scarcity. We shouldn't be making people's medicine scarce.
Exactly. Like, anytime there's access with medicine, it's going to cause anxiety, and we see that in the psych industry. We see that everywhere in the health industry.
Sorry, do you want to?
Yeah, I was wondering, like, back to what you were saying earlier, like, do you think, like, part of, like, with the directionality problem, are you noticing that people with these neurodivergent traits are like more susceptible to cannabis use, or like are you saying that they are just already having a higher baseline of stress, or like a little mix of both?
It's complicated. I don't know that you could say like whether or not it's true that it would indicate earlier use, but it's possible. I mean, I for sure was starting to drink and do drugs because I wanted this to change.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that like there's a component of that that is true, but I mean the only thing that indicates early drug use that we've found in psychosis is trauma, and is childhood trauma and different other social marginalizations and vulnerabilities essentially. And I think that a component or a way to look at this is that the higher stress that is experienced just period in general means that there's a greater reward. There's a greater therapeutic benefit. Some people try cannabis and they're like, cool, like, and that's, you know what, they're fine. They're not my cup of tea, but that's totally cool. And that's a totally normal reaction to cannabis that people can have. They can try it and be like, I love that for me sometimes, you know, but some people try cannabis and they're like, wow, this is how my brain was meant to be. And this must be how other people are out here doing that, you know, and those are two very different responses. And I think that specifically within daily consumers and medical patients, there's a high prevalence of people who have that, wow, this is balancing some component or some interaction in my life, right? That's different. And I think that there's reality for both of those to be in this data set, right? Like, and it's just, we can't say what is for sure the driving force. We can just say we observe it, and that there's a potential that's like what we get to see, right? And that this data is from the federal government. So like, you know, we don't know how truthful
Self-reporting
this one
bias.
is. Yeah. Did you have a question?
You're trying to answer my
Okay.
question.
Okay, great. Yeah. We want to the next one.
Okay, so this is kind of a similar chart. This one's showing the WHO disability score. So the World Health Organization uses some conglomeration of questions to decide how disabled someone is based on the answers. And what we see is that on average, the average population is much less disabled than the daily user of cannabis population, which
makes a lot of
Not
sense. It's
surprising.
not surprising, especially when you go to medical advocacy spaces. Like, it's very, very clear.
So when someone in the chat says, are you suggesting that neurodivergent people who daily consume are potentially self-medicating?
Yes, I don't think
That's
it's potential.
absolutely what
That's
we're-
absolutely what is being suggested. Also, like, the thing about self-medication too is like, this is the other thing, like there's all this, it's like self-regulation and I mean, I could say that like the bigger impact of like my diet being medicine too, like it's complicated at a certain point, like when you want to change your perspective on what medicine is and on what healing can be. These are like, now I'm like, you know, on this 50-foot view of being like, decolonize your mind. But if you get to the point where you are seeing things, like the way that I'm seeing things, that I'm not seeing people necessarily self-medicating, I'm seeing people try to regulate. I'm seeing people being like, it is hyper-inflammatory out here, and we were not meant to take in this amount of information, nor were we meant to navigate this level of like, I mean, whatever, everyone has lived through hard times, and like, so it's all subjective, but like the whole point being that clearly we're more inflamed than we've ever been before, like in a dietary way, in a lifestyle way, in an information and stimulation way. And that this comes with the need to regulate, and that for a lot of people, cannabis is absolutely part of that. And that medication is one way of regulating, and it's one way of viewing cannabis. Spirituality and self-care is another way of viewing it. Nutrition and nutrients is another way of viewing it. But yes, I mean, I'm a pharmaceutical scientist, so absolutely it would be medicine too. I think that too. Okay, so yeah, we're more disabled in general. It's like it's a combinatorial thing.
Okay, so the language used in the original acquisition of this data suggests that anybody who had specific combinations, or maybe just numbered combinations of these co-occurring factors, would be either mentally ill or not have mental illness, just on a spectrum of any mild, moderate, and serious. And so this shows that on average, high consumers are both more seriously neurodivergent, and also just in general have any type of neurodivergence. So the high consuming population is generally just more neurodivergent than the average consuming population.
Which definitely makes sense. Like half of Star, it's like it does make sense because also like everyone who's sat around their like circle and wax philosophy about any number of stupid things or funny things or anything knows that about like creative minds too. There's another reason why cannabis goes with creativity. Like it's a really there's a common thread here for why like certain people are drawn to it
and feel the need to use
And
it as a regulatory tool.
this data point was really actually, even though I know it's federal data that like is saying bad things, it actually made me feel really seen because 1 out of 5 daily cannabis consumers has a serious neurodivergent classification, and I'm definitely one of them, and I felt a lot of shame around that, but 20% of us is actually a good number of us. And anyways, I thought that was interesting.
Do you want to do this one, Dr. Shields? I feel like.
Okay, sure. Okay, so what we did here is we pulled out the neurodivergent daily consumers. So basically here in the 50%, there's any. And now we're looking at challenges with self-care. So self-care are things like washing yourself, brushing your teeth, driving yourself to work, grocery shopping, the daily things, anything that you have to do to keep your housing, your food, and your healthcare and yourself, like, you know, fed, sleep, all of this. So challenges of self-care. And there's a clear relationship here. On average, like only 7% of the average population will have some level of challenge of self-care, and only 2.5% have like significant to unable where they need to have someone else and they're not independent. Daily consumers, it bumps up a little bit. But then when you get into the neurodivergent daily consumers of cannabis, you get this like huge peak where it's almost 1 out of every 5 people who are neurodivergent daily consumers will struggle with self-care. And struggling with self-care is something that if you have never struggled with self-care, you cannot fathom how much it affects your ability to do everything else in your life and the spiral that it begins once you stop being able to care for yourself. So like, it sounds so simple to be like, why don't you feed yourself and give yourself water? It's like, sure, I can certainly do that better for a pet sometimes than I can do for myself. And I'm also in my own brain telling myself to go fuck myself because I have a hard time telling myself to do things. And I think that there's all these aspects about being challenged with self-care that are, you know, it's a shameful thing. Having a disability is something that people feel a lot of shame around, but there's actually ways that you can come around that. And I've actually used cannabis to circumvent some of my challenges with self-care by linking cannabis as a foundational link to a behavior chain of my self-care and considering cannabis as part of my self-care. So this was interesting because cannabis is an accommodation that helps a lot of people, and many people consider cannabis self-care. And so that alone is really important when it's a population that struggles to find things that meet that need in our daily lives.
Okay, so yeah. Okay, so they were analyzing self-reported overall health, which has a lot of bias inherently, but if you're going to self-report your own health, so in general, the average population considers themselves excellent to very good health, and the average high use population consider themselves good health or below, more likely. And so as high consumers, and then especially the neurodivergent high consumers, they are just less healthy in general. And is that because they're using cannabis, or was there always this link beforehand and that's the reason that they have to use cannabis to regulate?
I think people want to say that it's like your cannabis use. It's like you're lazy and that's why. And like, it's, oh, you have a poor cardiovascular thing because the cardiovascular health thing. And it's like, I don't have a single memory of my body when it wasn't in pain. Like no one knows except for me what it felt like to be in this without cannabis. And I have met so many other people who feel the same way, that it's just overwhelming that it all tracks, and it's just a different way of viewing like the same data.
Okay, I think this one is pretty interesting because this is like a co-occurrence map of different specific neurodivergences, and the higher the percentage, the more likely they are to occur together. And so these top 3, ADHD, autism, and generalized anxiety disorder, have a lot of co-occurrences. And I think if you talk to most donors that you know, they probably would cite one of these things as the reason that they use cannabis, or that they know how cannabis affects them in relation to these specific disorders. And so it just goes to show that the neurodivergent population of stoners is really out here with 3 or more. I think 3.1 was like the average number of co-occurrences. So that means that high users, high consumers, pun intended, are out here with multiple different kinds of neurodivergences affecting them, and that cannabis is a tool that can be used to regulate multiple different things while just being one product also at the same time.
I thought it was interesting that there are similarities in the co-occurrences, which can make sense, but some people had many things. And I think that in terms of like the similarities, eventually one of the things that we with NAP want to pursue with taking this research further is to understand more, how can we see this and understand how we can better recommend product types and recommend starting points, and how can we take information like this and be able to understand how we can better suit specific populations for things.
So I know we're talking a lot about like daily consumption and like stuff like that. Are you noticing, or has the data looked at like the amount of THC, like higher levels of THC in that daily consumption having a greater effect?
So not this data set, but in our longitudinal data set, we looked at the amount that people consumed just generally, and there were two separate groupings that were interesting of like what we were calling low responders and high responders, of two groupings of people who like, there's two dose responses in general, two peaks around which like people coalesce. And so I think it's going to be very person to person based, and it has to do a lot on your tolerance, you know, other things that you consume. I did see someone in the chat was talking about fatty acids. Like when I change my diet, different things like that also affects the way that things feel. So yes and no. Like the data is that there are different response levels, and clearly people have different tolerances and different things they use for different purposes. And then at the same time, so there's personal variability, while at the same time there's person to person variability in cannabis use. And that's why like the public education component will be important, so that we can all understand and harvest more data. Honestly, this is just one analysis. Oh, sorry.
Just a clarifying question. So like everything that's labeled is neurodivergent.
Indication, yeah, it's like it's a category, it's a box or a label. And then on the other side, so on, if you go across the row, we're seeing here 73, there is 73% overlap between people who had ADHD and autism, and it was a co-occurrence. So like so here it's like the really high ones here, general anxiety with OCD, that tracks, and CPTSD with schizophrenia also tracks. But that generally there's like the same number of co-occurrences. It kind of, it followed, which tracks the general pattern of what people reported, right, for cannabis consumption. And I think that it's interesting because there is at least a commonality amongst a lot of cannabis users, specifically in the medical advocacy community, like meeting people of all ages that are a lot like me, a lot like the people like me. And I think that like those commonalities and those co-occurrences, it's interesting that you see them in every single one, basically, because it's not like every person that had migraines also have epilepsy, but 50% of them did. That's very high. And that makes sense because migraines and epilepsy share some of the like trigger point depolarization mechanism. And so similarly, if we can find how cannabis can help some of these things that are linked together, or how we can find how specific things in cannabis that are being driven to it, right? Like what you study with aroma, and understanding like different aspects of mixing ratios of cannabinoids for specific purposes. Okay, so last one.
Okay, so this came from the Project Chronic data set. So this was collected by the survey online. And so this shows that, so blue is the average population. So the average population.
People reducing pharmaceuticals. Oh.
Yeah, so the average population of people reducing pharmaceuticals is higher than, okay, actually I need your help.
Okay, they have more, okay, this is the number of boxes that people checked. So if you were like reading down this list, like I would check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm one of the people who probably would skew the data if I was in here for sure. But the average was 3.1. And if you look at the distribution of data, that was interesting too, because it wasn't a Gaussian distribution. It was a non-Gaussian distribution, meaning that Gaussian is a bell curve. If you've ever had a class that's created on a bell curve, you know, it's like that's called a normal distribution. And normal distributions indicate that there's like the average is representative. And if you don't have a normal distribution, that means that you likely have two populations, because you likely have two averages for that reason. And this data isn't shown right here, but the distribution wasn't completely normal. Like it was non-Gaussian, meaning that a lot of people had either 1 or 2 indications or like 5 to 6, and then the average ended up being at that 3.1. I should have showed that data actually, but I don't think I ever generated the histogram. So the people who had more, the group of people who had more diagnoses were more likely to be reducing their pharmaceutical use, and the people who had less were less likely to be reducing their pharmaceutical use. So whether or not it means that you being diagnosed with more things means that you're in the system, which means that you've been part of the system, being medicated for longer and needing to switch medications, or that having more indications means that you're more complicated and that there is something more non-typical or non-standard going on, and then you're not responding well to one medication. In general, people using cannabis for reducing pharmaceuticals are more complex and have more and fall under more of those categories. Okay, great. So now I'm just going to do a few slides on what the future directions for NAP are, what the purpose of science advocacy is, because as a research scientist and as a biochemist, like the purpose of my basic science research is just to add knowledge to the universe and to increase the understanding that we have of like the basic interaction of the chemistry of these plants with the chemistry of our bodies for health. But for science advocacy, the purpose of this work that we're doing is different, because the direction is about how we as a community can understand and frame our medicine in a way that leads to more legal protections and the ability for us to advocate for ourselves in different spaces amongst like friends, family, and workplace environments. So the first one, cannabis is one of the safest drugs we've ever discovered with low toxicity and high efficacy. That's just a pharmaceutical standard fact. If we were to look at this in comparison to a tox of any other number of the things that we readily and regularly push on people, cannabis is safe and it's not toxic and it's highly effective. And the reason why we don't think about it this way is because we don't hold it to the same standards. And so when we're talking about this population, the neurodivergent daily consumption population, highly disabled and impaired, people who are going to be taking other drugs instead of cannabis, it's not cannabis or sobriety. It's cannabis or alcohol, it's cannabis or benzos, it's cannabis or opioids, it's cannabis and all of those put together, cannabis, not plus stimulants, right? So we need to acknowledge that, especially for this population, cannabis is one of the safest drugs we ever discovered, low toxicity, high efficacy, and that the risk that comes from it is a risk in public education and a risk of our own understanding and intentions of how we use it. The academic and medical research communities have never studied the higher needs medical cannabis patients or daily consumers from a neutral perspective. We've always been studied from a negative perspective. My funding for my PhD came from the National Institute of Drugs of Abuse. My funding was for the development of synthetic cannabinoids. Like my whole PhD was for pharmaceutical cannabinoids, to develop pharmaceuticals for it. And, you know, being part of that population and hearing how they talk down about me was really damaging to me. And it is the perspective though, and it is the prevailing perspective in a lot of academic and medical spaces to view the population of people who rely upon cannabis daily and as daily consumers, as addicts, as substance users, which I've had that diagnosis on my chart given to me by the person who gave me a benzodiazepine script, right? So the irony of all of these things is only apparent when you can acknowledge the fact that we are a marginalized population that then now is just being only viewed under the context of creating our own problems, when I think that if all of us were creating our own problems, we would fix them immediately. And so our data with NAP is supporting that cannabis is a therapeutic accommodation for people who are multiply disabled and socially vulnerable. In general, it's not everyone, because daily consumers are a huge number of people, and we cross racial, socioeconomic, and geographic barriers. We don't all look the same or talk the same or anything the same for that matter. But one thing that we do have in common typically has to do with the challenges that we face and how cannabis can help that and can improve that for ourselves and for the other people in our lives. And that this is a common thing for a lot of people who end up consuming daily, and that we end up finding that community and that wellness and that pattern, that respect for the plant, and that this is different. And it's actually something I think right now in the markets that we're facing in the industry is having a difficult time right now in many of the markets. Medical advocacy is not at the forefront of adult use profiting. It's not at the forefront of any profiting for that matter, since the more consumers are educated, the pickier they are going to be about what they purchase. And for a fact, in general, the more educated consumers get, the more interested they get in growing their own and in providing for yourself. And no medicine is going to be as good as the medicine that you grow. And no control or power over your own health will ever be as good as food that you grow and things that you create for yourself. And I think that that's something that is inherently clear amongst like how we prioritize, how we talk about cannabis from the medical benefit, is that we haven't actually valued the people from the legacy and the people from the past that have been the medical providers for all this time and have different methodologies and different information as well. And it's something that we really want to start valuing in that way, as well as advocating for all of us, because we've been viewed as the problem, and we're not, in my opinion, at least. They're the problem, in my opinion. So to learn more about other things that NAP does, we have other projects going on. So the real world lived experience data I was talking about, that's our longitudinal study. We're actually going to launch the second phase of this, where it's later this year, and I'm really excited about it. But this is the detailed look at what daily consumption, or not daily consumption, what your consumption looks like on a day-to-day basis for 2 weeks. That's on our blog. And we've been presenting it. We have a couple different iterations where it's a process of getting it sent for peer review right now. We do research on the endocannabinoid system, which is the system in the brain that interacts with cannabis. We're looking at how all the different molecules in cannabis, not THC, because we don't touch THC in that laboratory, but we are looking at how all the other molecules in cannabis are contributing potentially to the effects at a molecular scale. So specifically, like, how can we take a whole product and compare it instead of just looking at these single things? Then we're looking at the science of smokability in collaboration, the CRC, and this is just about quality of the smoke. People don't like talking about smoking because it's not the healthiest way to consume, but it still is the most popular way to consume. And especially amongst medical patients, and depending on the age of people, like I'm older, and I definitely am a flower person, and I'm not planning on changing that by any means. And it's about the effects for me. Listen, I'm all about the effects. I want to feel good. That's why I smoke weed. And so looking at the quality of smokability and understanding different parts about the grow and cultivation that could lead to the chemistry of that. And then the science advocacy, or weird brains. This is just about bringing neurodivergence into a different space, because neurodiversity is still a concept that is more new, or the framework of looking at mental health in a way that isn't from a bias or like a sickness or an illness mindset, is relatively new. And we want to help bring those conversations to spaces where it's a little bit less. And if you want to check out, there's more on our website. And then thanks. If I'm here to answer any questions, that's my contact information. If anyone wants to reach out, you can put ACS Journal Club in the subject line of your email. And if you like what I do and want to support what I do and want to buy me a coffee, that's the way to do it. And I'd appreciate it. But thanks everyone for showing up. And if there's any questions or anything, yeah, so let me know. Let's turn the lights back on also. Then and I'll let them, do you want them to listen? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. What do you think are some steps that we as like the cannabis community should kind of take to help pivot us from this like stigmatized framework to something that's more inclusive?
That's such a hard conversation. I mean, like, I think that the conversations that happen in the living rooms are the most important. I think that the conversations that we take away, like we as a community and every person, I believe that every person in the industry should be an advocate. And I do not like the people in the industry who are not advocates. But I feel that's a little harsh. I'm sure there's someone out there that I like. I can't think of one, but I'm sure there's someone who's not an advocate that I like. I'm sure. Maybe. But I'm just saying that, like, I think everyone in the industry should be an advocate. And I also think that, like, in terms of the community, like, the first thing you can do is stand up for yourself. And start to understand how you view your use as medicine, and start to feel really confident in yourself and your own ability to defend that, because then you will be able to reach people at conversations where you're not defensive. Because I used to be very defensive, and I think like that defensiveness comes out in that conversation. Like I used to be very like, like me and my dad, like, But then, I mean, I also got my PhD, that helped, but like,
Oh, for sure.
but that helped, that helped for sure. But like,
God,
but it was all about like how it also comes to like the approach to the conversation about being like, I respect your opinion on that. Like, I hear that you have valid concerns about that, and I can see how you were educated to feel that way. But here's what it is from my perspective with like my understanding, and like, and I think that like coming to terms and educating yourself and feeling really confident in your own ability to explain how it helps you is the way that people make these personal connections where they're like, well, I know someone that smokes weed for productivity, or I know someone who smokes weed for their anxiety, and they know the person, and it's this like personable thing, and they're like, you're not a lazy degenerate, like you're not like a burden to, you know, whatever it is that they're thinking that causes them to think about cannabis consumers as like non-productive members of society. And I think that like there has a long time been a silent majority of people who can use cannabis and it does not a detriment overall to their health, and they're able to regulate, and you regulate your use. Like my use tops out at about an eighth a day, and that seems pretty high, I think, but like it really isn't, given that I have more access now and it could be higher. Like I'm just throwing it out there that like I thought for a second that it was just going to keep ramping, you know what I mean? But it didn't. It really curbs at around like 1 gram to an eighth a day of flower equivalent, and I have unlimited access now. So it's not like, it's not, and that used to be the scarcity, right? But like it's the same argument that people have about people getting gayer and gayer, right? Like this is the same argument. Oh my God, everyone's getting so gay. So it's like, you know what? First of all, what's the problem with that? But the whole thing being that like people are seeing it as an increase, right? Because if you look at the generations, there's an increase in number of people who are comfortable with saying that we're queer. But that increase is not exponential, nor is it linear. It's actually decaying. It's saturating, which indicates that we're reaching a level of social acceptance, although who knows whatever. Hopefully we continue reaching levels of social acceptance where we're saturating a curve, right? And so the same indication with like cannabis consumption stuff, like people will be like, no, you're an addict. I think that's probably the most common thing. It's a super easy thing to be like, and I mean, it's not super easy, but let's break down what addiction is, like getting to the point of being like, I'm not an addict, and I know that because of all these things. And it's fucked up that we have to defend ourselves in that way anyways, in comparison to other things that we readily dose daily, and that no one would even consider telling someone, have you thought about taking a break from your pharmaceuticals recently? I'm worried that you're becoming too dependent on those. No, they're telling you stay on them. You know, they're telling you, no, it's going to work. You got to keep waiting it out, you know, like that kind of thing. It's the same thing. It's like, oh, maybe the cannabis just hasn't fully worked yet. I just got to keep waiting it out. 20 more years, you know, 20 more years.
Well, okay, we have some questions from the chat. We
Okay,
have quite a
okay,
few, so
okay.
we're at 6:30 right now.
Yeah. And then we can hang out for a little bit. So, okay.
Is there a good way to determine which types of cannabis are more helpful for the individual? Is it all trial and error?
Right now, unfortunately, I think a lot of it is trial and error, but I think that we can very safely say that people can balance CBD and THC to have an easier entry point into the situation. If you look at the historic data from like the DEA and like what cannabis was like before major prohibition era stuff, like it was very low in THC. And so like historically, what was cannabis in the past was different chemically than what it is now. And I think that it's pretty safe to say that a lot of people find hemp to be an easy entry point for people into cannabis consumption, where you can kind of like start with hemp and start experiencing there and ramping, because the effects are very mild. And I think people are fearful. I think people get fearful about THC, even though it's totally normal and the effects are not extreme at all. I think people have a lot of anxiety around the potential anxiety, and that anxiety around the potential anxiety gives real anxiety. And then it is true that THC can cause anxiety, and there's a biphasic, and then everyone, meaning two phases, a phase where it decreases anxiety, a phase where it increases anxiety. Some people's windows are super tight. So for me, for edibles, 1 milligram, and I'll probably be like, okay, 1.5, it depends. Sometimes 2 to 3 milligrams, not cool. Like immediately not cool too. Like seeing shadows and scary things, heart palpitations, like, and so that my level of threshold in my edible threshold is super tight, right? Versus like with smoking, my threshold of the two effects is very large. Like I can tell if I'm gonna get anxious, and sometimes you can just smoke more or smoke CBD or smoke something different, right? And it like balances it out. So I think that there could be, and there should be a way to introduce people to it, but that it's also very difficult and it's a high risk. If we were to put out a protocol, that would be a very high risk thing. We already are a big liability in the realm as scientists. I'm not saying I'm out there telling people to do as I do. I don't say that. But as scientists, being out there, being clear about the personal choices in our lives that actually are contrary to what is the healthiest way I could live my life. But it's like, I'm not trying to be the healthiest thing that Andrew Huberman thinks is healthy. I'm trying to be the healthiest and happiest thing that I'm experiencing in this body. And so I think that that's like, it's a complicated thing. And I think that we could say something, but no one feels like they can, I think.
Talk to your friends.
Yeah.
When they're not on Zoom and they aren't being recorded, talk to your friends and talk to your friends who are neurotype matching you and see what helps them.
Yeah. That's true. I've had cultivators when we were in Nova Scotia, I've had people come up and be like, follow your content, like think a lot about your brain. I think you'll like this, people really like this. And it's typically it's typically something pretty heavy aroma, purple. And like, yeah. And it's that heavy hitting classic indica couch, what we used to say mattered back when that did have a meaning.
Okay,
It was
so
okay.
off the tangent, sorry.
It's a good tangent. Okay.
Can you go into, or if you have the demographic, income, race differences within daily cannabis users versus the general public?
I can't go into that. I'm very interested in that, but we're actually hoping to partner with other groups to get better data on this, because we know for a fact that, when I say we know for a fact, let me just zoom out and say that in survey work in general, and when we're talking about research in survey populations and demographics in general, we know that if we don't actively target minority and marginalized populations, we will be excluding them by default. And so I can't say anything to that data yet, because we have not actually actively targeted specific communities, and we need to. And it's something that is one of our main priorities in our collaborations with other people in communities, because just like this was a community endeavor from the neurodivergent cannabis community that self-reported for us, we need to have and activate and empower other communities to do the same things from within. We can't speak from other communities. And I can speak from the communities that I would like to collect data from as well, that I'm passionate about looking more into, and like specifically, like definitely with the intersection of being queer, definitely also like third culture, AAPI type things, like cultural things, but that we are hoping to be able to do this research. We submitted a grant last year actually specifically to do this, and didn't get reviewed, likely because we're cannabis. And they're like a social equity grant, just like in a general sense. But that absolutely no, this is an issue too, because when we talk about neurodivergence in general, the ability to conceptualize and be seen by the system in certain ways is absolutely a racial and socioeconomic topic. And so there are nuanced things that are very much so at the core of what we believe is important about this data, but we need more data. I can't speak on it. I can only speak on what I believe, which is not as helpful as getting the numbers eventually.
I think this might be the same kind of answer. How does daily cannabis use among the neurodivergent population compare to the use of other drugs? You had some information about other pharmaceuticals.
Some information about other pharmaceuticals. I have some information about other natural products and the willingness that people have to branch out and try other natural products, and what people would call compound drug users, poly drug users, like technically everyone be drinking coffee, but I think that what we're really asking about this is like, is daily cannabis consumption different than other daily, both what is illicit or viewed as that like rec black market, or the daily pharmaceutical? I think that you can find examples within the population where people are meeting both. Mm-hmm. And you can find examples within my day where you're meeting both. If you were to meet me at MJ BizCon or at any of these conferences that we're going to, like, you meet me at a conference, I'm on a schedule. I'm on a dose schedule. I need to be, because I'm interacting with hundreds of people in a bright lights, loud noise environment for like 12 to 14 hours, sometimes like 18 hours. And so you're going to get a very different version of me. And that version of me, that dose schedule would likely be paired or aligned with a dose schedule that someone would be like, oh, wow, that person is literally consistently dosing up to their peak all the time. And it's like, yes, that's where I want to be if I'm going to be in that environment. If I'm going to be having strangers come up to me and really I need to be connecting with them because I want to connect with the people who connect with my work. I don't want to be disassociated and like not in my body. I want to be there. And if I'm going to be there, I'm going to be on a dose schedule. And that dose schedule is going to look a lot like what would be people would consider like illicit or rec use. Now, my daily day-to-day is probably going to look way more like someone who doses like an SSRI or something that's like an anti-anxiety thing. I smoke in the morning. I usually smoke in the middle of the day, and I definitely smoke at night. But like I'm doing stuff in the middle of the day, and like stuff is getting done. And that's like probably more aligned with what people would associate with like a pharmaceutical dose schedule. So how about this? My first smoke of the day is almost always pharmaceutical dose schedule, because it's like the first thing almost I do in the day besides drink coffee. But
Okay,
the
have
rest
a
of it's
few
different.
more.
Oh, okay.
Someone wanted to make a correction that BPD is borderline personality disorder, not bipolar disorder. And they mentioned that they wanted to be corrected if possible.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for pointing
Catching
that
that.
out.
And then someone else asked, does long-term daily cannabis use in ADHD cause dopamine receptor downregulation and a need for increased dose to be effective?
I mean, I don't know that we can say that for sure yet, but we know that it modulates it. But do we know specifically within populations what that is going to do in a long term and what people are using and consuming? Because the next thing that we have to parse apart when we're saying that is that there's people who respond very differently to stimulant medication. And like stimulant medication can make some people tired, right? And like can make some people, and versus can make some people like, you know, stimulated or opposite. And I think in a similar way, there's going to be differential reactions to dopamine and reward processing. I also think reward processing is complicated because when it comes to just in general behavior and reward, if we zoom out from dopamine for a second, we're just looking at how the human brain processes all of our reward and behavior. There are differences in the way that different brains respond to reward and behavior, especially when you work in neurodivergent populations among people who have differential, and it could be upbringing wise too. Like there's definitely cultural differences. And you can see that. I think we were talking about parenting. We were talking about earlier about parenting, and there are differences in the way that we process our reward just generally by how we were rewarded. And I think that that is also something that has not yet been able to be pieced apart amongst us, is like how we are the same, how we are different. And I don't want to say that it doesn't happen or that there's like the need for more and more and more, and there's a need to continue hitting it. Cause like, I think that to chase the dragon of like that first high school high, it's like that naive situation is like not going to happen again. And I miss that for sure. It's not like you can't get that sometimes again, but like we won't talk about that here. So yeah, we won't, we'll go there. It's feasible, but the point being that you're not going to, with cannabis, like have some of those same like epiphany, like profound type things when it becomes a more routine thing and it becomes more like medicine. Because it is true, at least for me and for a lot of people, it seems like it's true that it becomes part of your normal functionality. So it's not necessarily like you're needing more and more. It's more like you are finding where you like my brain now when I'm dead sober is much more like I'm high than before. Like if I remember what my brain was like before I started smoking weed, I am more like that all the time. And yes, that was the desired effect. Thank you very much. Like I was going for that actually, like because I'm calmer, I'm more regulated, I'm less angry, I'm less likely to throw a tantrum. Like, you know, I'm way more palatable. Not, I guess, probably still working on that part, but you know, those are the types of things where it's like the concept of that dopamine rush and that dopamine chase, you know, those are subjective. You can replace that with other things. You can alter endocannabinoid tone and work out. You could change your diet and enhance that cannabis. So inherently, the reason why I don't know that that's the way the question was phrased to come out though, but the reason why I don't like the phrasing of the dopamine chase and the increased chase for tolerance for cannabis, it very much so frames cannabis in this addictive thing. And I'm not saying that that question was meant to have that intent. I'm just saying that that's the way that I interpret the intent of that question being asked to me. We're talking about it in a way of saying like, oh, like, what do you have to say about this clear molecular risk? I mean, yeah, I have a lot to say about that clear molecular risk, mostly about the variability and the justifiability of that data in general. But like, how can we interpret and extrapolate these things yet when we don't have like the basic understanding of how dopamine and the CB1, the C2 and the CB1 receptor heterodimerize? They come together. The dopamine receptor actually physically interacts with the cannabinoid receptor. There's a ton of different ways, whether it's bias signaling or whether we have beta arrestin downstream. There is a bunch of different ways that we could point out equally with the pharmaceuticals, the same questions. And I think that's why it's not that I resent those questions. It's that I find them to be insanely ironic and frustrating because we never question them in any of the other things that we regularly do, including dopamine agonists that we give to children. So it's like, I think that that's like, it's just such a frustrating and difficult thing because when it comes to like cannabis and what we're talking about with like, I'll stop saying this, what we're talking about with this like stoner neurotype in this population of people that has been, for the most part, isolated and excluded from the medical system too. Like, these are things that just are commonalities between us. Like, what we have when we're talking about this is the lack of the medical and research community to acknowledge the existence of our existence because of the framework that they want to place us within, because we don't respond well to types of medicine that don't work. And those medicines work for some people, and that's fine, but the reasons why they don't work have equal amounts to do with the same molecular mechanism. And I think that it's hard. Being a pharmaceutical scientist has been like one of the most challenging things ever. I think it was meant in many ways, like, it was always going to happen, because I was drinking the Kool-Aid so hard of being like, I want to be like everyone else. Like, I wanted that so badly, like desperately. And like, to the point where I was like, I'll make myself a new drug so I can just take regular drugs like everyone else. Like, I could just be like everyone else and take a pill every morning, and like somehow that will solve like all of these other things that were, somehow that'll solve my chronic pain and my GI issues and like, just in general, my volatility. And, that just didn't turn out to be like necessarily the case. And the only thing that I'm saying differently that other people haven't said is that it's just like, let's look at the perspective here with like some of the questions that we ask about cannabis, because the answer is no, we don't know everything, but the answer is we don't know that everything about literally everything else also.
Great. I think that they have a personal experience where they said they wanted to clarify they work with Parkinson's, and they see that works with the drugs that they use in Parkinson's.
I think that part's really hard, because tolerance is always going to be an aspect of it, and you need to find the answer that I couldn't answer about finding the high school high is the answer to that question. And we will talk about it. You can email me. Actually, I talk about it in you can look at my other content. It's out there. I mean, it's certainly out there in public spaces. So
we are 15 minutes over. There are still a few more questions.
oh, we can download them and I can respond to everyone. I'll do it offline.
Cool. I think there's only like one or two more, and they were pretty specific. So we can get
okay.
the chat to you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. This was awesome. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, like, feel free, reach out, put the subject line ACS Journal Club, and CANN. And the paper is online, and I'll send it. We'll send an email.
Yeah, we'll send an email. Maybe I'll drop it in the chat right now, and then this recording will go on our YouTube channel with all of our other journal clubs. And if anybody is interested in hosting a journal club or presenting research your own or someone else's, you can reach out directly to me at publications@can-acs.org. And thank you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yay.